Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Inshallah, we'll continue with the fifth session today, and the topic is becoming, just allow me, sorry. Okay. Things now becoming more practical. So let's start with a simple summary, maybe. So far, this is the summary, what you see on the screen, summary from the previous session. But overall, we started with some preliminary, let's say, the topics, which are, we started with our need for guidance and how only divine guidance, the revelation, informing about the unseen. So these are very loaded terms, of course. We discussed first day, but how such a revelation would only address our needs. And we discussed about that. And then we discussed what kind of revelation we're talking about. Are we referring to a whisper into our eyes, the ears, sorry, eyes would be inefficient, or simply a book, or maybe an audio recording, and so on. What kind of revelation we would be after? And we did talk about the book, the scripture, the revelation by itself, if we can say, must be accompanied by a human guide who would practice it, live it, interpret it, and manifest it in his human life. We talk about all these details, and then finally we question, not finally, but also we question why not, like I'm a human being, I can also read the scripture or maybe listen to scripture and then understand it and then live it myself, which is true to some extent. But why my own being, my own human self wouldn't suffice, wouldn't satisfy our needs by itself? We talk about that as well, which led us to search for a prophet, search for someone who would be a perfect fit as a recipient of the revelation as a scripture, the one who is most aware of his needs, his neediness, the one who is the perfect form of being the worshipper or abd. Sometimes they translate it as slave. We were looking for someone like this. We said there must be someone who would guide me, who would accompany me when trying to understand and live the scripture, the revelation. We looked for such person, and we realized in the pages of history there was such a person with a name, with a real existence, Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, who lived around 14 centuries ago in a very specific region of the world. And we said, okay, this person, what we know about him and what we know about the message he brought and how they fit together. And then two of them have also fit to the book of creation that we observe constantly. We said, okay, that's a great match. But at the end, we still felt like, we might be still empty-handed. Like, okay, this person, Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, he was a prophet. He was a perfect, let's say, the exemplar of being a prophet. He transformed everyone around him. He started, let's say, a new worldview. But then he died. And our access to him through some, again, narrations, that everything about him, let's start from there maybe. Everything about him is historical. Like when we talk about him, we talk about 14 centuries ago, we talk about a certain place which existed in certain time in our space and time fabric. So everything about him historical. So the question, I guess, is how does his historical existence, his being a historical figure, not living with us today, would satisfy my needs? This is our, I guess, the biggest question.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting question. I think, maybe the first question to ask ourselves is, what does somebody mean by history? Because that's really the question. Because I think maybe like the biggest concern is that he is a historical figure, but if we kind of step back and say, what do we mean by history? Then, I think we realize that everything we're talking about is fundamentally history. Like right now, we're having a conversation that's history too, because just the idea that I need to communicate with you, that takes time. It's not like you're hearing my thoughts, not in my head, and listening to my thoughts. And you have to hear me speak. I have to utter something. You have to process it. You have to think about it. That's happening across space and time. By definition, that's history. It takes time. And that happens with everything in life. For example, they say that, I always think about this example, like when you touch something, they say, like from a medical standpoint, when you touch something, like the impulses travel from your fingertips across your neurons to your brain. I mean, that's the way, how they explain it mechanistically. But that takes time. It's not like the very moment that I touch it, I experience it. It does. That moment's already passed, and I'm experiencing it, and then potentially also how I feel about it is happening in another moment subsequent to it. So, I mean, if we think about history in that regard, then really anything we're talking about is history. My experience, my past relationships with people, my present relationships with people are fundamental history. For example, like, I mean, when you saw me today, it had been a while, but like you saw me today as I am in the present moment, but your perception or what you know about me is also history. Like you have a historical sort of perception of who I am, and you remember the past. So yes, I'm here today, but there's also a historical me too that you remember. So, our entire life experience, the moment it happens, it becomes our history, our own personal history. And, we all become a part of the history of the universe, part of the book of the universe, some preceding chapter that's already passed, some prior page. So, I think this like issue that, how do we relate to a figure that is gone? I can't see him in like just a lot of flesh and bones. But in some regard, that's our entire life. Is that if we really think about it, like the moment like this retreat's over and I have to reflect upon it, you may still be like quote unquote living, but your past self when we're talking or having this conversation is already gone. And I already have to reflect on that. And I can't get that moment back. It's already gone from me. It's in history. It's in my memory. So I think, getting out of this idea that we're dealing with a historical figure is probably the first issue that I think we encounter when we're trying to understand how does the prophet relate to our practical life.
That's interesting. Like especially the example you gave about like touching something.
Yeah, exactly.
It reminded me some primitive, the knowledge that I was told. It's not also So it's a great example in the sense that it is a full of narrations, actually, like a touching, because sometimes we imagine it as this impulse traveling to our, let's say, the neurons, is as if there's like an electrical signal directly moving, but it's not like that, right? Like something happens here, and then some chemical reactions, which triggers another kind of chemical reactions, triggers another one, up until our, the nervous system. It's all full of narrations, actually.
Yeah.
From one mechanism to another. That's an interesting example. So okay, it's easy to accept, let's say, at least conceptually, that okay, everything is historical. But when it comes to the problem, we're talking about like 14 centuries ago. It's not like a few seconds ago, or it's not even a few years. It's like 14 centuries. So isn't it that long to be reliable?
It's interesting. I always think about time, especially. I mean, not specifically related to this topic necessarily, but in relation to like Qadr, divine determining, and that our perception of time is like it's purely subjective. Like we think about 1 second is so short, but 1 year is too long. It's 1,000 or 1,400. And in one regard, if we step back and ask ourselves, like, why do we think 1 second is much shorter than 1 year or 1,000 years? Or like, why is it such a big dramatic difference in our mind? I always think about this. Like, I don't have a pet, but if somebody has a cat, like, the number of years that, I don't know how long a cat lives, what is it, like 10, 15 years, something like that?
Maybe 18.
18, and they make an equivalent between like human life years and cat years. Like from a cat's perspective, like they would look at me and they would say like, I'm an ancient person, because in for them, 18 years is a long life. And so everything's fundamentally relative. So somebody to come and say that, well, 1,400 years ago is such a long time ago. Well, I mean, there are people that we talk about who are even more quote unquote ancient than that. Maybe from 2,000-3,000 years ago, Greek philosophers from several thousand years ago. Nobody has an issue with that. And then also in our, practical, like I shouldn't say practical, but like this sort of scientific mindset that we can go out and measure things out there that are even beyond the nature, beyond just the order of magnitude of 1,000, beyond the several orders of magnitude, tens of thousands. I mean, not even millions. They talk about, millions of years. They try to measure the entire age of the universe, or what happened during these sort of different epochs, like the Jurassic era or the Cambrian era, these different eras of life, and they try to examine it. And no one has an issue by looking at something that far back in history and asking themselves what happened here, or what can we take from it. And I guess maybe one of the issues that like people have is that there's this like understanding or perception that we can sort of measure with precision like time so accurately from the past. When you look at the sun, like the sun's out today, it's the summertime, but going back to the first question about history, the sun that I'm seeing right now is already 8, 9, 10 minutes old. It's not the sun that actually emitted light. I'm already experiencing something in the past from the sun. And nobody has an issue with that because we can sort of, measure it with our instruments.
It's reliable.
It's it's reliable, because our instruments, we trust our instruments in a sense that we have. Or for example, when we talked about, I know in our discussions about like, the Grand Canyon being several million years old, 6 million years old. And you go there and you know that, not because you've seen the Grand Canyon over the course of 6 million years, you've seen kind of like when you said like you're touching and there's like a narration happening, you can see the narration in the layers of rock. And you take from the rock, I mean, the rock isn't human per se, but the rock is telling you its history. It's giving you its narration. And you are relying on your instrument, the trustworthiness or the reliability of your instrument to ascertain how old the rock is. What does the rock tell you about the past? What may have happened in the past history of the world? So, we do this in our everyday lives. I mean, that's what we do. We rely on things. We place trust in them, either because somebody else told us that you should rely on these things. I examined these things, I've studied these things, these instruments, for example, a clock, you should rely on this clock because it's a pretty accurate measurement of time. Rely on it, and it will tell you about the past, about where you are, and about the future potentially. So we do this all the time. Why is it really any different than when we talk about a human being, I guess? As long as we have, reliable means of attaining that information or knowledge.
And so the examples, like the cosmological examples, always, I find them very interesting. As you said, like when we look at the sun, it's already 8 minutes old.
Yeah.
Like we don't have access to the present sun, at least with our eyes, but we still trust them. And I guess like the sun is too close to us. If we look at the next closest star, it will become 4 years, I guess.
I think it's like several light years away.
Yeah, so it should be a few years of its past.
Yeah.
So what we see, it's past, and we trust it.
Yes, correct.
I mean, it travels in space, right? This narration. And if I'm not mistaken, we can even see stars that far, which corresponds to a few million years, maybe billions.
Yeah.
So which means we constantly processing this historical information.
Correct. Yeah.
And relying on them. That's interesting. So I'm trying to satisfy my the curiosity as well. So when we talk about the stars, the Grand Canyon, you talk like it's about the rocks.
Yeah.
So we assume that they don't lie, let's say. But with what we are talking here is a human life. Like somebody is talking, giving us information about a life of a human being. So when it comes to human life, can we talk about such, reliability that we can know about the human life, which is 14 centuries, lived 14 centuries ago?
I always kind of run this sort of like, it's kind of a interesting thought experiment I've had in my mind. I always think about this, because like I'm like in the medical field, like you hear these like extremely rare scenarios, rare cases where some child was misplaced at birth, and they went to somebody else's parents. This actually happened. I was listening like a couple months ago, and 2 children got misplaced at birth because the hospital had a mix-up, and then the hospital got sued. But I was thinking about like, how do I know that my mother is my mother and my father is my father? Like, what is like, because that's a human interaction, and they're telling me that, hey, I'm your mother and I'm your father. And so how do I know that? Unlike matter or physical matter per se, where like I'm relying upon like light, where technically it's not conveying to me, it doesn't have a human emotion necessarily, or rocks for that matter. I have to find some means or some mechanism to sort of reliably ascertain like the truthfulness. Like, how do I know my mother is in line to me when she says she's my mother? And so there's a whole science behind that. Just as there's a science behind how do I develop an instrument that can measure time? How do I develop an instrument that can measure the reliability of what somebody's telling me about somebody else? That's really what I would say, the science of Hadith entails, is trying to figure out, how do I know that this person in the past actually said this thing or something close to this, and that person who's narrating it is in line to me. I would argue, especially like, with like, if we take, for example, like the social media age, it's interesting. Like if somebody writes an autobiography, like you'll have a politician who write an autobiography,
I'm reading one.
Are you reading one right now?
Yeah,
Okay.
the Muslim figure.
Well,
but,
Muslim,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
You know, what's interesting about these autobiographies, I always think about that, it's usually the person interviewing the person, so it's one person interviewing the person who's being, like, the one being whose biography is being biography, life biography, from their perspective. And I always think about, is that truly reliable? Because the person being interviewed could be lying. They could be saying something that never actually happened, or maybe they said something in the past that had a certain intent, and then they rewrite in their mind the history of what they meant by that. And then the person who is interviewing them, how reliable are they? You're really relying on the person being interviewed, which is one person, and the person getting the biography is another person. It's really just two people total. Or, for example, let's say somebody says, okay, well, I could document somebody's life by, like, social media. You know, I mean, we all kind of know you can, like, delete things, add things, subtract things, you know. How reliable is that? And then I guess if we're talking about the prophet specifically, if you think about, like, a politician or some sort of other sort of figure in history, they're probably going to curate. They're going to, like, limit how much they may tell somebody in terms of their life. They may only tell me what their public life was. They may not tell me what their personal life was. They might not tell me how they were with their kids. They might not tell me how they were with their spouse or their family members, because you always hear that. Like, I always hear the people who've been biography, these, you know, these famous people, and, like, they're saying, oh, their family will say he was never like that, or she was never like. They were totally different than what's actually reported, which makes you question how reliable is what is the person being interviewed and the person taking down this interview. With the prophetic case, I would argue, and I don't think there's a person who has their entirety of their life, and not just one aspect of their life, like, oh, the public face. Like, I'm just here in Mecca or Medina, you know, like, in that outside. No, their personal life too, who's as well documented and reliably documented as the prophet. Because, and this goes into really the science of Hadith, but this idea that, like, if you examine prophetic narrations, the prophet doesn't give a one-on-one interview. There's no, like, one-on-one. He doesn't even actually, I mean, historically, he tells people to not even write down what he says during the time of revelation, so it doesn't get mixed up with revelation. So he's not giving a sit-down interview with anybody, you know, with these narrators. Not only is he not doing that, and then the people who are recounting his life, they are being taken into account or questioned as to their own reliability, their ability to remember, their trustworthiness. Could they have forged something? Could multiple people have forged something and on behalf of the prophet? There isn't really anybody I can think of in the history of mankind who has, like, that intense scrutiny about his life in terms of what he actually said or did. I would contend that's probably the most reliable source of, you know, knowledge we can have, information we can have. And as we talked about in the last session, you know, technically the Quran is also a narration. It's the highest level of narrations, narrated by multiple people. And, you know, one could argue it might be the most reliable message ever known to mankind. So
that's a like an interesting thing, and which reminded me, you know, another type of narrations we use today, you know, as a scientist or a philosopher or any kind of, you know, the domain. If you are publishing something,
yeah,
we always cite each other.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
we say, okay, we put a sentence there and put a reference at the end. You know, this previously published paper, you know, said the same thing or similar
Yeah.
thing. And as someone within the, you know, this endeavor, let's say, I know that it's not that reliable, this citation
Yeah.
system. Like, sometimes I read articles saying some stuff and putting references, and I know about this reference. Sometimes it's my publication,
Yeah.
like they're referring to my previous work, and I say, I didn't say such thing.
Yeah.
Like, or whatever we published was not about that. Like, how you using it as reference? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So but when I learn about, so I don't know much about the science of hadith. I'm not an expert there, but the one thing I know is that, as you said, the scrutiny that these authors put into their work, like they would travel certain distances, such distances, to make sure that this person really said that.
Yeah.
And what kind of person he was, and so on. So anyway, yeah, it seems like very reliable, at least in general.
Well, I want to add one point. I was listening to like a debate once between an atheist and like a Muslim philosopher, and they brought up the issue of testimony, scientific testimony. The question of is like, if I rely on somebody's prior experiment, do I actually replicate their experiment, or do I trust whatever data they report? But that's inherent to human nature. You can't replicate, like if you're going to build upon like some sort of scientific theory, you can't replicate every experiment in the past. You would never get any work done. You actually have to rely on somebody's, trustworthiness, that they're actually reporting accurate data. So there is some element of that. You can't ignore that. It's impossible within the human experience.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, and which relates to my next question. So when somebody like you tell me that, oh no, when it comes to the prophet, what we hear is very reliable, like a trustworthy. Does it mean that there's no noise there? Whatever I hear about him, I know for sure is true. Is that the claim you going with?
No, I mean, I think anybody who says that doesn't, I guess, understand that human beings can be, fallible. That's the whole point. That's why there's a science. If it were so obvious that, anything that was said was true, there would be no need for anyone to investigate how reliable it is. So, is it my job per se, like just, as an average person, to figure out who is or what is or what is not reliable? I'm not an expert, as you said, I'm not an expert in, that sort of science either. But what I can do is I can look at what is being said, for example, and say, as we talked about in the last session, if the prophet, if this person is a prophet, does what he say, match up with what I'm experiencing in my life? If it doesn't, then I don't bet. Even if it were reliable, what benefit do I get out of it anyway? There's really nothing, even if it were completely honest. Like if I don't have the question, if I'm not looking for if I don't have the right question in mind of what I want to get from the prophet, then it's irrelevant whether the narration is reliable or the highest level of reliability or weak or anything in between. If I don't get anything out of it, then that's not going to make any sense. But if I am looking for something, and obviously I may have this concern, is it reliable? I have to ask myself, or at least be honest with myself, is what it's saying, does it sort of match up with my humanity? That's really the question I need to ask myself. If somebody says that, okay, well, how is this, you're giving some room for error. Oh, well, when I measure the light from the sun, then there's no room for error. But
You wish.
yeah,
You wish.
you wish. But inherently, any scientist will tell you there's an error in anything we do. There's an error. There's a standard error measurement. There's nothing precise because no instrument can be absolutely precise. So why do we make that a requirement for human beings either? I think just like an everyday experience. Let's say when you said somebody quotes you from an article. Whatever our expectation is, whatever our sort of expectation of what we want somebody to say or what we want to hear, we will sort of maybe twist or distort somebody's words to fit what we want to hear. So even, for example, somebody may say something nice to you and you don't like that person, you may take it in such a way that you find it as oh, he's insulting me. It's what your expectation is. What are you trying to get out of it? And so you have to really ask yourself, what is my expectation? What am I looking for? And knowing that, no human beings, but neither any instrument's going to be perfect in giving me completely reliable information about a figure that's no longer here. but I have to ask myself, does it really match up with what I'm looking for? Because like, the example of, if I take an image or a picture, like like in your field of a human brain, it's not going to, it's not the brain itself. It's going to give me an image, a representation, a pixelated representation of reality. But it's close enough or good enough, even though there's some noise, that I can get what I need to get from there. And that's what's important.
I have some images, if you don't mind. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Just to give people more idea. Forget about the bottom part. So the top is like some brain images, and you would know better.
Yeah, MRI.
But the sharp ones are usually from, like, let's say, research protocols, meaning spending a lot of time to get them. So when you go to like a clinician, the doctor, what you get is the rightmost one, most noisy one. It's really interesting, right? Like the images that we use in the clinics are the most noisy ones,
Yes.
because need
It's
to be
faster,
quick.
faster and cheaper to do, but it's good enough to at least see what we need to see.
Exactly.
But nobody questions that. Nobody says that, oh, this is unreliable. So,
Well, you need it, right? Like if you have for instance, a tumor in your brain,
yes.
and if you want it to be extracted,
Yeah, you need it to be. So I guess if we make an analogy that if I need to know something practical in my life, for example, let's say, how do I make wudu or something for prayer, or how do I cross the street? Or let's say, how do I, like, then I'm going to need something where if I want the degree of reliability, maybe I need something far more precise than something else. So you're right. I mean, there are certain situations where I may want to be more certain about whatever is being conveyed. And again, that's what a Hadith scholar does, or a legal scholar does. But if we're trying to answer questions about, like, my human questions, first and foremost, truthfully, I can use my own measurement, my own spiritual measurement, and like, what am I looking for? What do I want? Is it going to be satisfactory to me? That's our own measuring tool, as long as we're honest with ourselves. Because like I said, somebody can tell you something and you may not want to hear it, and you take it for what you distort it, and you find it not beneficial. So it depends on what your expectation is to begin with.
And so I guess it's also important to mention that so it doesn't mean just because I rely on terrible sources. So in this example, for instance, like it is pretty noisy,
Yeah.
but for an expert who are experienced in that kind of data, when they look at this noisy image, they will know how to extract the pattern they need.
Yeah.
So they would know, for instance, the neurosurgeon, they would know where in your skull to open a hole and where to get into, so that they will extract the
They have enough
tumor.
experience to know.
Exactly. They don't need something like the bottom that taken by smartphone. They wouldn't say, "Oh, I need a very sharp image," not because they
don't want it.
Yeah, they don't want it, or they don't need it. That's precision for their job. The precision they have, it's good enough for them. They don't even feel like in complaint.
But what's interesting is that, like, another analogy is that the reason for that is because they have experience.
Yeah.
They have practical experience. So for example, like for a narration, it may be quote unquote noisy, but if I use it in my everyday life, that's how I verify it. That's how I know that, oh, this is probably true. Even if there is noise there, even if it's not completely reliable, I use it in my own life, whatever he said, or however he viewed the world, or whatever advice he gave, or lesson or perspective he gave, and I say, oh, is this applicable in my life? And I apply it in my life and see if it actually works or not.
Plus the experience of the people who are first narrating, right? They had a lot of experience that, as we discussed in the previous sessions, they were watching the Prophet almost 24 hours, 7 days. So the experience they have, it's so high that they can easily extract the pattern
Yeah.
they need. Plus, the ones who compile these narrations, again, they are so experienced interviewing all these different people, they can extract the real pattern out of it.
I wanted to just ask some clarifying questions. So, at least in terms of how this session began, it seems like there was an argument about the inevitability of temporality, right? That everything that we're involved in involves time. And second, that in our everyday life, let's say, or in the things that we trust, in the things that other people, as you said, perhaps narrate to us, there's that same pattern of narration or the same occurrence of historical narration happening. And so it seems like there's an appeal in one sense to how everything else is done in our life that we accept. Is that correct so far?
So I would say like accept part might be extra, because like this is how everything else is,
Yeah.
and this is how we are.
Just the nature. of
So
things.
so then it's also then an appeal through the sun example. It's an appeal to how the order of the world that we are in operates in one sense.
Mhm.
I guess okay, so then I was going to say if it's an appeal to how other people do things and we accept, like people narrate to us using that word specifically, like, oh, when you touch something, this is what happens, and there is that serosity or whatever that is occurring there. I was going to, my response to that would have been, or a thought that comes to me in terms of that is, well, is that a sufficient enough justification just because the society that we live in relies upon that accuracy and we trust it, whether it's through scientists or other ways, does that mean it's right or sufficient? But then there's that larger appeal, maybe this is a sturdier appeal to just the order of how we observe the world to work in. And in terms of that, and that argument is very similar to the other argument we had for the necessity of a prophet, which was that, this is just how our learning happens and we are in need of, this is just a learning experience. So in terms of that, a thought that comes is, well, yes, that is how things that we label as ordinary, as in just like the order of the world, that is how the order of the world is. But does that mean that we should expect something involving a prophet to necessarily work within that same order? Does it not, if there's going to be any exception, any exemption, wouldn't this be such a case where the order is not, or there's an exception made, just as, miracles are an exception to that order that we observe, right? Or it's just a different way of creation that we're observing. Wouldn't this be such a case where it could also be such that, well, I'm in need of a practical guide, living, breathing, and so what I'm asking it is it enough that everything else in our life operates within some sort of historical context, such that we should expect this to also operate within that, is the question.
Well, I guess what I would say is it's not as much an expectation as that, as you were saying, that's just the reality of how things are. You can't, even you brought up miracles. Miracles by definition are also historical. I mean, no one, as we talked about last session, no one can actually observe the splitting, or no one has since then, observed the splitting of the moon. It's never happened since then, or at least not anyone that's ever reported that. So by definition, you can't, just the nature in which things are brought into being, we can't escape by definition the historical nature of the world.
But it seems like, just push back a little bit.
Yeah.
It seems like you're saying that's the reality of the world because that's the reality we experience. But if there was maybe a different form of reality, we would say then, oh, this is also the reality that we experience.
And
But
probably the narrations of whatever the form of relationship we would have with the prophet would be part of this new reality. It wouldn't be other than that. Like it wouldn't be different than this new reality.
But the thing is, can you really conceive of a world where things aren't fundamentally historical?
like, I'm just wondering if the conclusion that we're coming to is the conclusion we're coming to because it's already been, that's how we sort of seen it come.
Well,
I need to maybe work in a better
go ahead.
formulation.
No, please.
well,
I don't know.
I guess what
Did I formulate it well? I'm not-
I guess what I would say is I'm looking at the world. I look at my own life. And I say, that's how I am. You know, I'm living. I have a past, I have a present, and I may have a future. So that's just the way the things are. What is the best way I can ascertain what happened in the past? That's what I'm asking. And to me, you know, the only way to ascertain about a human being, just like we do everything else, is we need something to actually reliably measure what happened in the past.
Yep.
And so that's what we need. That's really what I would say the analogy basis of that. Or you want to say?
Go ahead.
So I think like practically speaking, let's say from my T-Mobile phone, if I call your AT&T phone and you are, let's say, in the other side of the continent, I am here, what would be happening is from the T-Mobile tower, it goes to some other tower. From that tower, it goes to, I don't know, some satellite goes to AT&T, all the way it goes to wherever you are, like multiple bounces of communication. I will say hi here, you will hear my hi 2 seconds later. So this is something part of our reality, like there is narration, even different companies as towers and whatnot. But in this case, we are like the historicity is not the problem. I guess this is where it's boiling down to.
Yeah.
Because the question was, this is a historical figure. How can I? So what is being said here, as I understand, is this is a very wild question, as it is. Like it's not the historicity that is the problem, because everything is historical.
Yeah.
Their scope is different. Some of them is 2 seconds. Some of them is like we say, oh,
2 billion.
2 billion.
2 billion years.
2 billion years. Doesn't
Yeah, 2 billion light years and whatnot. So we say, well, there are narrations through 6 different people. Well, AT&T tower to T-Mobile tower to whatever, like multiple companies, my data is transferring through. But the issue is, I trust that my data, my hi, is not changing as it goes to your ear and you hear it as hi. And I have a reason to believe as such. So now I guess what is being questioned here is, this is what I'm taking from this measures, the issue about measures. So when it comes to the narrations and the Hadith literature that's followed, that is expertise on that, how trustworthy, what is the measures that are being taken in there? And are they as reliable as me saying hi and believing that he's going to hear what I say? Because this is not part of the experience, and we are okay with that. And this is, so we have a level of okay and not okay for our day-to-day experience. And when it comes to Hadith, so the questions that are being arisen is that it is, well, maybe it's beyond okay. It's not okay. So because of these many years, because of it was first written 150 years later, because there are 6 people in the chain. So these are potentially being presented as sources of unreliability. But the question is, are they? So I think this is, by giving the examples, as I'm hearing from you, when it comes to, let's say, the writings of, I don't know, Plato or whatnot, am I questioning it? This is another issue, I guess, because it's, again, 2,000 years to 1,500 years before.
Right, but not questioning that, the fact that, you know, like using that as a basis, it becomes a little shaky because just because it's not questioned doesn't mean it's necessarily like, oh, they don't question, so that's why we should question it either. I get what you're saying, and that's helpful, I guess, and I'll say this because I don't want to interrupt further the dialogue, and it might, you know, end up answering some of the questions I have in the first place. But I guess what I was thinking about was, let's say, for example, in terms of the third session, right, where we're talking about the need for a prophet, we kind of even though we're working through our experience and everything, we are talking about a theoretical necessity, right? But here we're not talking about a theoretical necessity of how things should be or what must be, but rather based on the fact that and I'm sort of responding to myself now, based on the last session or the last few sessions of first there must be a prophet, and I see that this historical figure Muhammad must be that prophet or could be that prophet. How can I then form that relation? That's the question I guess that we're dealing with, rather than the sort of necessities of how things should be such that I can attain or get access to that guidance.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would say this is not that much true in that sense. So I don't see any difference with the necessity of the prophet. There must be a prophet, versus what we are saying here is that if anything is any information reaches to us, it must be through narrations and historical. So that's, yeah.
That's a big claim.
But so okay, when I say there must, in both cases, there must be a prophet, it's not an a priori the thinking, like a theoretical you said, that we step back from our realities and construct, we don't do that. What we do instead, we look at our reality and we say, as a human, I'm a human being, and this is my reality. And within this reality, there must be a prophet. So we do the same thing here. We look at our reality, and within this reality, you cannot show me anything which is not true narrations and historical. Even something within me. I feel something, for instance, right? There is always a distance between this feeling arising and it is being reported my consciousness. There is always a reporting process between a feeling arising and my consciousness experiencing it, even within me. So I guess it is theoretical in the same sense that there must be a prophet.
So then my last comment, the approach is not, what it is not, is that we see that there are historical narrations. Let's see if this is a good, if we can justify the fact that we are using historical narrations to rely on.
Yeah, so there is nothing to justify the fact that we are using a historical narration, because we always using historical narration.
That's the only way.
Exactly. So I guess the justification is everything is historical, everything is in the narrations. So there's no categorical difference between the things, but there are differences at scale. So some of these narrations, some of things in our life, so let's put it that way. Some of the things, let's not call them historical or not, but the things in our life are reliable, trustworthy, and some of things in our life not trustworthy. And then the question is whether what we know about the prophet is trustworthy or not. So unless we are discussing on such a base, as Yusuf said, I would say, wait a second, you are starting from maybe bad intentions because you are name calling. You're saying that, oh, this is historical narration. Everything is historical narration. What is wrong with this? So the question should be from the beginning is, oh, you're telling me this about the prophet, but is it reliable? I guess that's the question.
So historicity is not the source of
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
reliability.
And also, but I totally agree with you in that when it comes to prophet, we expect a miracle, an exception. And I think we have an exception. I don't know, like personally, of course, this is my maybe tiny miracle. Maybe it's not a miracle for others, but I don't know any human being who lived who has his life, entire life,
Documented.
documented, narrated with this scrutiny.
Well, not, they developed an entire science behind.
Exactly.
Entire science behind.
Just the entire science
one
being
person.
developed for that purpose. I don't know any other example. This is a truly exception. We do have an exception there.
Yeah.
But again, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I don't know.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, there isn't any other, no one's life's ever been scrutinized that much. Or assigned, people dedicated their entire lives to, I mean, if you study the science of Hadith, where people memorize people's biographies, narrators' biographies, question their memories and trustworthiness and where did they live and all, for one person, it's never been done before. So, yeah, it's, I mean, if one were to say an exception, that would be the exception.
So, but thank you for this comment, because like it also clarified in my mind as well, which I will come to you with new questions because of her. So, so things getting, I guess, clearer for me as well. So, okay, we say we have this information, and the question is, like, we will use this information if we need it, and we don't use this information if we don't need it. For instance, a surgeon wouldn't use these images if he didn't need it. I guess that would be maybe a repetition after all these sessions, but do we really need to know about the Prophet, like to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, I guess, to the last sessions and yesterday. You know, what are we looking for? What questions are we trying to answer? Human questions. And if we see the Prophet through the lens of our human questions, you know, where did we come from? What are we doing here? Where are we going? Those three basic questions. Then I guess you would say then necessarily we need somebody to help answer that question for us, because the fact that we have those questions, it's not obviously apparent to me. If the fact I'm asking the question, like I need something or someone to tell me or aid me or guide me to try to answer them. Otherwise, I mean, you know, I'm just walking around aimlessly in life. I need some sort of help or guidance. So the fact that somebody would develop, or not even somebody, a group of people would develop an entire science to assess the reliability, because the claim is that this person will answer those questions, then yes, then it is necessary. I mean, so many other people found it necessary enough to develop, that we talked about, the science to try to figure out what he actually say.
Let's go there, like it's talking about this, the sources, the narrations, and we are talking about this, their trustworthiness, and I guess as you commented, the whole question or whole discussions, I guess, boils down to these sources that we are talking about. Like, what are these sources that we are referring to? How information about the Prophet comes to us?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would use, like, you know, my own, you know, like somebody's personal life. He's a human being just like me, so his sources should really be the same as anybody else's sources. For example, I mean, who would know you best? You know, your wife, or potentially your parents, or your siblings, or your children, or your closest friends. Really, that's for any human being. That's who knows somebody the best, or who somebody works with, or deals with, or transacts with. I mean, I don't think he should be any different. He's a human being. It's not like there's some robot that's going to live with him and it has some human emotion. Because when you think about like narrations and the reliability, you're not just conveying words. Like if we're talking about like your question about how do I know what he experienced, you can't necessarily convey that in words per se. There's a human element, like human emotion to that. So you need human beings fundamentally to convey. It's not just a transcript, but a human element to how did I feel about when he said this? How did my own life transform? And that is, in some sense, built into narrations, because the idea that somebody would fabricate, let's say, on behalf of the Prophet, one could ask the question, did that person actually get the message of the Prophet to even begin with, to the point that they would fabricate on his behalf? So there's a human element to it, and also just the literal element. What did he actually say? And it obviously would be the people closest around him, the people who were most affected or transformed by his life. So those people would naturally be around him, and then the people subsequent to that, him, after their generation, the people who they narrated to, and so on and so forth. So.
And we think they are trustworthy for some reason.
So the question of why, like, I haven't met those individuals, and I'm not a Hadith scholar. So I mean, if you go into the science of Hadith, the people who did narrate them did have to know who these people were. Like, I don't know who they were, but people who did study this science did know who they were, or they knew people who knew who they were, and they had to assess to the best of their ability the reliability of this person's ability to narrate, whether from their ability to remember and how honest or trustworthy were they. So, it's the same thing as saying, as I mentioned earlier, if there is, for example, let's say, one of the hospitals here produces some sort of scientific publication. Would it be reasonable if their publication is known to be trustworthy, that they wouldn't fabricate things because they have a certain reputation or a certain, standing within society or the scientific community? Would people generally question the reliability of what's being published? Probably not, because there is a certain peer review. People are judging them. People are assessing their credibility. The same thing applies here, I would say. People are assessing the credibility of the narrators.
And maybe on top of that, it seems that the people, the narrators, the original, the first generations we're talking about, there seems to be something special about them too, right? Like they witnessed the prophet, they lived with him.
Yeah.
And as we discussed in previous sessions, they were transformed by it to the extent they would devote their life, maybe.
Yeah. So, some people potentially, as the companions themselves, the idea that, like, for example, if somebody is devoted enough to the prophetic message that they would risk their life potentially to be killed or imprisoned, and then to say, I'm going to fabricate something on his behalf, what's the necessity for that? Because if you're willing to die for something, to hold on to something, that means you truly believe in it. And you're going to, in your best of your ability, try to hold on to it and convey it to somebody else. That's why I'm saying there's sort of human element to it, in that also, for example, if somebody feels something very strongly, for example, let's you're a researcher. If you feel very strongly about your research, you're going to publish it and try to convey it to somebody else to the best of your ability. And somebody else who feels strongly about it will try to do the same. They'll try to coach you. The same thing can be applicable here. A person or a community or a group of people or a generation is so moved by his life, that's what they're going to do. They're going to try to hold on to it, and people subsequent to that are going to try to hold on to that. And the idea that people would travel, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles to try to figure out or collect historically his narrations tells you their own devotion, even centuries later, about how much they were devoted to the idea of trying to preserve what he said, even though they never met him. And they probably didn't even meet the people who met him. They might have met the people who met him, or the third set of people who met him, or the third generation after him. So it says something that a group of people would devote their entire life. Like we were talking about earlier, how much would you give up for like a Nobel Prize? I mean, people devoted their entire life just for the study, and not just one person, but multiple people to study one person. That should in and of itself tell me about how serious they took what they were doing, about trying to understand who he was.
And maybe this is another exception. Like, we talk about people who devote their life for, for the work they do and so on. But the devotion we usually think about is like just reading a lot of books. He was so devoted to his work. He used to read all night,
Yeah.
and so on. Or sometimes it's only some the kind of like a being patient with some physical, let's say, torture. Or he was so devoted, or she was so devoted, even was ready to get into prison and so on.
Yeah.
But when we look at these companions, we see that they leave their entire life behind and started a completely new life,
Correct, yeah.
transformed in the true sense. They were ready for everything with the message they received. So I guess this is another element of trustworthiness.
It's I guess if in my own personal life, if I were to say somebody came and changed how I see the world, and then somebody asked me, who was that person? What was that person like? I don't know what incentive I would have to lie on that person's behalf. Like the two don't make sense in my mind. So because if somebody came and changed my life, for example, we brought up the idea earlier that pre-Islamic Arabians would bury their daughters alive. And now suddenly it becomes, inhuman to kill an ant. To go from burying your daughter to say, I'm not going to even kill an insect. Like, what sort of like change in your worldview has to take place?
And one of the most famous companions was about to kill the prophet.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly. So what change has to happen in your worldview? And then you're going to say, I'm going to make up a lie now about the prophet. It doesn't make sense. And not just one person, but a series of human beings, an entire generation would do that. It doesn't make any sense to do that.
And so maybe a similar question to the one we asked previously, like maybe it's not their bad intention, but they just mixing true with the falsehood.
Yeah.
But the examples you gave, like the truth and the falsehood was so separate, like it was so clear to them.
Yes.
Like they experienced both of them at the same time. So it's not like us, for instance, today, the truth and the falsehood so close to each other.
Yeah.
Like, can you do that? I think look from the left and says, it look nice, and I look from the right, the same thing. I say, no, it doesn't look nice. So for us, everything is so mixed. But at that time of the prophet, with the message, the initial light of the message, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, when things are so clear to you, then the idea of lying or willfully lying or with some bad intent doesn't line up with the rest of your entire life. For something that small, like if your entire world changed because of one person, the idea that you're going to lie now, which it's not congruent. It doesn't line up with the rest of his lives, and your entire view of the world has already changed also. Why would you lie then on his behalf either? So, and not just one person, I mean, like I said, it goes into science of Hadith, but multiple people lie on his behalf.
So I see.
Yeah.
And like when I hear such things, in the moments of honesty, let's say, I look at myself and I say, every time I question such things like whether I can trust these people or not, I realize that I put my mirror image there, so I pretend as if they are like me.
Correct. Yeah.
And then I question my trustworthiness. And most of the time, the answer is unfortunately not that bright about myself, my trustworthiness.
I guess the question would be, maybe if I were in that position or you were in that position, what would you do? Because I don't, while I would say that, they were companions and they received his message from him personally, it's not like I can't see, they're human beings. It's not like I can't see myself there. So if I were in that position, would I, or any set of group of people, would they be in that position and say, now I'm going to sort of fabricate something on his behalf? Maybe from the present day, you're right, where, truth and falsehood are not quite clear. People can kind of say whatever they want to say and it becomes truth as long as you say it enough times. But I'm using the perspective of modern society and projecting backwards. So.
Yeah, using the projection of the modern society to understand the prophetic
life.
tradition, right?
Tradition, yeah.
So I'm not sure where the line between this session and science of Hadith comes and goes. I mean, it's a little blurred perhaps, but like one thinks about how, okay, like with his closest companions, the people around him who were, I guess, transmitting his sayings, behavior, could do that sincerely and to the best of their abilities, right? And I know that, like, you know, to a very limited extent, that science of Hadith is very rigorous in its own, like, as you guys said, like science developed by itself, and there's, I guess, like mechanisms and stuff like that. I just remember, like, my first year of grad school, I was like taking this course on like Quranic studies and stuff like that, and at one point there was some text talking about Hadith and
Talking about what?
Hadith. Like it was talking about how, like, at one point it might have been 1 or 2 centuries after the Prophet's death, like there was so much like false narrations circulating. Either, you know, one thing I remember is about like one person wanted to sell his type of bread, and so like all these narrations about bread, like to increase certain sales, or like these sort of things motivated either by, you know, the interests of one person, or perhaps in later times interests of some sovereign or some king. So like one also thinks, I guess, I mean, that would require, for me, delving more into how is this rigorous process working, but that it entails a sort of a seriousness and a seriousness or rigorousness, not just in one, like the immediate century after, but like all 14 centuries. So how do I reconcile that, or how do I go about it such that, you know, now 14 centuries later, I can have that sense of like, I guess there is, as you said, at one point, certain noise, but like this larger portrait that can still emerge, that, and the litmus test of, well, is this something that is guidance for me? But then again, there are hadith that might be considered, you know, like sahih and correct and everything, that seem very like, you don't really know what to take out of it, but like, you know that there must be something there. So that litmus test is also not like me saying, oh, is this like really divine practical guidance or not, is not always the best approach either, because I can only know the approach to take after I know if I should trust it or not. So I don't know, those are just some thoughts
That's a great question. It also seems that you are following us perfectly, because the next question was about that. May I, or would you like to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I guess my take on that, that's a great summary of the actually our position here, which is like the discussions about the prophet, at least to me, always starts backward. Always. When we discuss prophet, we always start with a certain hadith and question it, or talk about some political environments, or as you said, you know, some economic environments trying to sell bread. And we start from there. To me, as far as I see, if I'm not mistaken, all the presenters, what we are trying to do here is reversing the order and making actually in the right order. Let's start with questioning whether we need a prophet or not. Whether the prophet is necessary, the type of necessity of the prophet, whether the prophet is necessary or not. Forget about these bread selling people. Because you will always, whatever the topic is, you will always find some bread selling people. You will always find some, let's say, the arrogant or arrogant doctors. I apologize, I know you are a doctor.
Or professors.
Or professors, less professors, more professors, more like a scientist. Like if you, let's say, wave your hand like this, you are surrounded by scientists, you will touch at least 50 of arrogant opportunist scientists. The question is, should you be, distant yourself from the idea of reasoning for that reason? No, or the medicine. So we should, I guess, start from the right order, whether the prophet is something I need or not. And I'm assuming that we established this to some extent in previous sessions. And then we came to the point that a specific person, the Prophet Muhammad, whatever is, we know about him, perfectly fits this bill. And we say, okay, there is also a prophet as well. Now the question is not, at least to me, is not whether I can trust the narrations or not. The question is, how am I going to benefit from this prophet? Because we started from a need, now comes to question, how am I going to benefit from it? But again, we always take it in the reverse order, and instead of asking this question, how am I going to benefit from a prophet that I established, that I conclude as being a prophet, if I'm there? How am I going to benefit from him? And instead of asking these questions, whether these narrations are reliable or not, let's start from there. But the question is still there, whether I can trust these narrations, because this is the way we interact with. So in this session, we said, okay, let's again reverse the order and see whether we have any reason not to trust the concept of narrations. Conceptually, do we have any reason not to trust that? And I think what we said so far, no, we don't have any reason. And the next question, let me address this question to you. But we know that some of these narrations, majority or not, we don't know, but some of them, bread-selling people, they are not trustworthy. So yes, we still trust the medicine, but there are some ignorant doctors. So we trust the science of narration, let's say, because we want to benefit from the prophet, but there are some untrustworthy ones. What am I going to do?
Yeah, I guess.
I personally become, what am I going to do?
Before you get
Oh,
there,
yeah.
I want to underline one thing. So with that picture, so as you were highlighting the need, I think it's very important. I just want to underline it once more. If I am going to get this brain surgery, and if this is the picture that I have, although noisy, I would beg you to really make use of that. And don't just experiment on me saying, oh, let's open the whole skull and see if what happens if I enter from here, if I start removing brain from here. I would love you to really, really please, because I don't want to die on the surgery operating desk. So please make use of it, so that I would like to live another 5-10 years, whatever, and see my daughter's marriage and whatnot. So this is what I think is the need, and this is as we were trying to establish it. So given that I am needy, and here are the resources that I can benefit from, so I guess it looks like our question becomes, how am I going to make use of that? Or how well can I make use of that? Rather than saying that, well, this brain image, it looks blurry, so let's just open the skull old school and see what's going to happen. So I wouldn't do that. I guess this is what.
And again, there is no reason, there are really no reason, no real, let's say, reason not to trust them, not to trust this image.
Yeah, what I would add to that is that first, the question about like reliability. And to that example, I'm relying fundamentally, I mean, not to get technical or go into science, but relying on people who actually studied the science of Hadith. I'm relying on a surgeon who can look at an image and say, oh, this is where I should go, or I need to go, and I'll go there. So in some sense, yes, the bread selling people, you're right. That may be a little bit more obvious. I remember, and this speaks to my own reliability or unreliability. There's this hadith or fabricated hadith in which this guy, I don't know how many centuries after the prophet, was telling people you need to recite, I forget what chapter of the Quran he told them to recite, and that you would get the benefit, like on saying this on Friday, you get the benefit of reciting the entirety of the Quran. And these hadith scholars approached him and said, why are you telling people this? And you're fabricating hadith on the prophet. And he said that I was telling people this so that they would be encouraged to read the Quran. So in some sense, yes, even a hadith that may sound sound, that may even seem reliable without just me looking at it, oh, it sounds reasonable, maybe. It could be fabricated. But my job isn't a hadith scholar. Like I'm not that. But the people who may have actually benefited from that, they may have actually been encouraged to read the Quran because of that person is saying that. So the question is, what is my expectation? Is my expectation to sell bread? Like, am I trying to make money from selling bread? Then I'm going to use a hadith regardless of that. I may not even care if it's reliable or not at that point, because my expectation is I'm trying to find some justification to try to do something. Whereas my role, not being a hadith scholar, would be just simply to, what can I get out of it that may be beneficial to my life? Like you were saying, even if it is reliable, potentially, if I don't see the practicality, maybe because the prophet was speaking to a specific person in his specific era, within that specific context, then maybe I don't get the benefit that person would have gotten because he was talking to that person. At that point, the reliability doesn't make any difference then to me, because I don't get any benefit out of it anyway. So what difference does it make? My role then really is simply just to see how is it applicable in my life and does it match up.
If it is coming from prophet.
Yeah, from the prophet, and I have a need, like you were saying, like I have to actually recognize my need for a prophet. A prophet, not just for my perception of the world, but also the practical aspect of my life too. Like, how do I live? I don't know how to live my life. There are people telling me how to live my life, but how do I live my life? So I'm not born into the world knowing how to do things necessarily. So in that regard, my expectations or my orientation has to be a little bit different. Like, what am I expecting out of it? For some people, hadith may be a way to become a legal scholar, and people do that. They want to get a job. For them, their perspective is, I'm going to get a job as a legal scholar, as a faqih, and I'm going to make legal judgments, good or bad, and that's their motivation. And so that's what they use it for, and that's their expectation out of the hadith. But everybody gets what they want out of it at the end of the day.
So, I will ask, if you don't mind, a practical question now.
Yeah.
So, let's assume, okay, conceptually at least, that such things are necessary, and we don't have any reason to argue against them, and they fulfill certain need. And even if we have a mechanism, let's say, to assess their trustworthiness, we say, okay, if it is from Bukhari, I will trust it. But when we open, let's say, the book of Bukhari, we see certain narrations. I call it one of them here.
Okay.
There are certain narrations which we think they are trustworthy.
Yeah.
Like when we look at their background, it seems trustworthy for us, and we are trying to benefit from them. But with our modern sciences and so on, we know what happens to sun. Like there's earth, there's sun, there's rotating and so on. Hence it sets and then it rises and then sets, the sun. Yeah. We know what happens in reality, let's say. But when we look at some narrations, this is just one example. Of course, we can multiply this again. But it seems, let me read the text. It says, this is a narration from Abu Dar, It says, I entered the mosque while Allah's messenger was sitting there. When the sun had set, the Prophet said, Abu Dhar, do you know where this goes? Where does sun go? I said, Allah and his apostle know best. He said it goes and asks permission to prostrate.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we note that it doesn't go anywhere. Like it stays there, maybe
Yeah.
rotating like around itself and
Yeah.
some other galactic, the entities, but it doesn't go anywhere. He said it goes and asks permission to prostrate, and it is allowed. And one day, it, as if being ordered to return where it came, then it will rise from the west. So if I'm not getting wrong, the Prophet is saying that every time it sets, it asks for permission,
Yeah.
and if its permission is granted, it rises from east again.
Correct, yeah.
But one day the permission will not be granted, and he will return where it came, so it will rise from west. Then the Prophet ﷺ recited that, and the sun runs on its fixed course for a term decreed, which is from Surah Yasin. That I also copied it here, as it is recited by Abdullah. And the verse which is cited is, the sun travels for its fixed term. That is the design of the Almighty, all-knowing. There's, I guess, another version of the same, from the same narrator. So what I'm trying to say, okay, we're talking about the need, we're talking about the trustworthy, and we started with, in the previous section, that it must fit to the book of creation.
This
And it doesn't seem to be fitting to book of creation. So what am I going to do with this? Like, the point is not, interpreting this specific hadith, of course. If you can, that would be great. But the point is not that. The point is, like, how am I going to approach this hadith? So what is the point there? What is the purpose there?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess it goes back to the earlier sections. What is our expectation of the Prophet? Is he going to teach me mechanistically? Like I brought up the water cycle, I think, in the last session. Like this happens, and then this A happens, and B happens, and C happens, and D happens, and E happens. And just one big circle. Just like this, one big circle again. But in some sense, he's actually telling you, like we talked about, how things really are. Because if I step back and ask myself, like Abu Dhar, and say, where does the sun actually go? And I think about it, like, what is actually happening? Like, it's just everything happening on its own, as if, it's happening, the travel's on its fixed term by itself. Because this is what's happening in my life. Like, the world is just moving around. I'm spinning around the sun, and I see it rise up in the east and set in the west every day. Is this what's this is what I'm taught in the school every day. It's just one big cycle, one big circle. And apparently it seems like this is how things are. So is that the mechanism? Because my definition of what the world is my like apparent sort of perception of it, devoid of any sort of creator, devoid of not just a creator, but a creator with a will, and not just a will, but an absolute will that has, control or a choice or a will over everything at every moment. If my perception isn't that doesn't make any sense, because then I think the sun has its own will, or the earth has its own will, and it's just, or gravity has its own will, and it's just rotating around, the earth is rotating around the sun every day, 24 hours a day. Whereas he's coming, I think really any hadith can be read in this way, is that he's explaining, I wouldn't honestly call it, this may be controversial, but I wouldn't call what you read in a science book the mechanism. There's not like the mechanism, the secular mechanism, and then this one. There's only one mechanism. And there is what happens like in the physical world, but I can't divorce it from saying what is actually happening, because I know the earth and the sun don't do anything on their own accord. They can't. They're just a lump of matter. Like, what do they know about anything? How do they know what to do anyway? And he's saying that by asking permission to prostrate, he's saying that the sun doesn't belong to itself. It belongs to an almighty, all-knowing creator, one who knows the course or how things operate, how things come into being, because he must be the one that brings them into being within that sort of framework, within that sort of order. So the rotation of the bodies, like the Earth around the sun or any of the other planets, they are under a will. That to me is what permission means. And he's trying to speak in that way to people in his era, trying to get them to understand this is how it's actually happening. Is that there's a will at work or a will at play that you don't perceive in the physical world, like per se, you don't see will physically, you see just the manifestation of will. And this is what we call the mechanism. Falsely, we just say, oh, this is how things operate. And the way we know that also is what he's saying is that it doesn't have to be this way. Like if I think about it, every day I get up and I just presume the sun rises from the east. Like if I think about it, why does it have to do that every day? Why do I have to wake up every day? Why does my body have to operate the way it does every day? Like we're having a conversation, why does my ability to speak have to be that way? I can extend this example to everything in life. Why does anything have to be the way it has to be necessarily? And that's his perspective, is that he's seeing the manifestation of the will of the creator, absolute will of the creator at every moment. And he's saying one day, at the end of the universe, at the end of the life of the universe, it will rise from the west, and that will be the end of the cosmos. Because what it's saying is that the cosmos don't have to be the way you want it to be.
Because there's a choice.
There's a choice.
will.
There's a conscious choice behind it, that it is this way. And one day it won't be that way, and that is when the end of the universe happens. Because it doesn't have to be that way that you want it to be, or you think it has to be. There's no mechanism per se that just operates, like a deist would say, just operates. You just set it in motion. I live by, I mean, that's kind of how, even though I kind of say this, that's kind of how I live my life, or we all may live. Like we live our life in motion. Like somebody set us in motion and we're just, oh, okay, I do this, I do that, I go here, I go there, I eat this, I feel this, I think this. Like there's I. There's no creator, beyond that or behind that. And in a sense, he's giving the tafsir of the verse, an explanation of the verse, as you mentioned from the story Yasin. The sun travels for a fixed term, like the Quranic method and the prophetic method is that I see something in my practical life. I see the sun and I see the earth and I see the sunset every day. That's a practical experience of my life. It's not some figment of my imagination. It's not like something I made up. I see it. Just like somebody today would see it 1400 years after the fact. We see the same thing. And the Quran, and what he's saying is that you see that, but then what is your reasoning behind how it happens? What is your explanation behind it? Are you saying that, because Abu Dhar has the same question, how is it happening? Is there a conscious will behind it, or is there not a conscious will behind it? Is there a conscious will behind it? Almighty, meaning all powerful and all knowing, one who knows how these things operate and has the power to do so. Is it behind my life too, or everything else's life in this universe, or not? And to me, that's the prophetic sort of message. For example, practically speaking, we talked about earlier about, if I'm going through some sort of hardship, is there some sort of, do I step back when I'm like experiencing some sort of anguish or pain or some illness? Is there a conscious will behind it? Do I have to, just like the sun rising from the east, do I have to be healthy every day? No, I don't have to. There's nothing necessary in my body that says I have to be healthy. I just presume it to be every day. I wake up every day and I feel healthy. One day I may not be. One day I may be good.
So your health every day goes and prostrates.
Exactly, prostrates.
Ask for permission.
Precisely.
One day the permission will not be given.
Right. Yes, exactly. One day, one moment, every moment I could say every breath I take is asking for permission to live. One moment, the next moment it may not be, and that's when somebody dies or leaves this earth.
Yeah.
So, given that this is in Bukhari, and we say that this is most reliable source, and we already established that in terms of their expertise, I trust them, all the reasons you said, very nice. But when I read this, given that this came out of Prophet's mouth and somebody heard it and narrated it as they heard about it, all good. But you read it in a different way. You didn't take it literally. Why? I mean, because reading it literally would make it hard to accept this. But you turn it into a way that it's going to be acceptable. I mean, the way you said it makes sense. Very nice. But is this what really Prophet meant, or Prophet was literally speaking and then you're making this up? Like, why did you speak the way you speak?
Well, I would say two things. Why is there an expectation that the prophet is speaking literally? Like, that is the first question we ask. Like, what the expectation that when he says it, he meant it literally? Like, I have to ask myself that question. If I don't expect it to be literal, then why do I expect somebody else to say it literally? Just because there's history, he's from 400 years ago, he's backwards, he doesn't understand how the world works. That's my projection from like the modern world. Oh, he could not have understood how the world works. You know, that's why he has to be speaking literally. And then second of all, like the fact that he quotes the Quran here, what perspective is he using? Is he trying to understand the world from this sort of material perspective, this like mechanistic perspective, or is he trying to tell people how things really are? And if I'm trying to tell people things how really are, I can't speak except using analogies or metaphors. Like, I can't show you God's will manifest, like not in reality. I can show you manifestation. Like, I can't show you these things, but I can give you some sort of analogy or example. And especially to people who may not have completely comprehended during this period. Even I don't maybe necessarily comprehend it. And I need an analogy, I need a metaphor. Because I don't understand how will actually operates, like in reality. I can't see will, I can see the manifestation, and I need an example. So we have to ask ourselves, from what perspective is the prophet speaking? Is he speaking like, oh, he's a scientist? Because our expectation, he's a scientist, he's a doctor, he's X, Y, Z, everything other than being a prophet. Because we think a prophet means those things, rather than trying to understand the nature of the world.
That's a great point. I have something to add, but before that.
So I just wanted to raise this question that might also occur. I speak as a no, not from me. So earlier, when we had talked about the necessity for the existence of a prophet, we had said that there are many different approaches to Quranic scripture, right? And that I need a practical guide that can show me how to live it rather than read it. So then, at this point, a question that arises is, well then, do I need a practical guide for the practical guide to understanding the practical guide? If, you know, of course there are certain, like there can be descriptions of behavior, but then when it's just normal speech like this, that also involves, let's say, jumping through hoops to understand certain analogies or symbols, then doesn't that bring us back to where we began, right? That's like negate the very role that he was supposed to be fulfilling for me.
So I think I guess my one pushback is, like, for example, like if I go out and drive on the street and I see like a light that says red, like I don't drive through the red light. Like, there's a symbolic representation there. Like I mean, nobody says like, oh, that's a nice color red. We're just supposed to keep on driving.
You might have to in Philly.
Some people might, but the vast majority of people will say, oh, well, I should probably stop. That means to stop. And how do I know that? You know, to your question, do I need a practical guide for a practical guide, or for a guide? I would say I need somebody who studied his life and who knows what he's trying to say, or who understands his, because it's like saying somebody wrote a science book or somebody wrote a book, and then I need somebody to teach me what the book says. Is it because I'm inadequate, or is it because I'm ignorant in terms of the method by which the prophet teaches? And it's not that I couldn't understand, just like the level of a science teacher. It's not like I couldn't be a science teacher, potentially. But at the level I'm at, maybe I do need somebody to try to understand his mentality.
I just want to intervene. And I know you're going to say something. Maybe you're going to address it. But I mean, that was like the argument that I started with as well, that I need a teacher to teach me how to approach the Quran. Now I need another teacher to teach me how to understand the prophet. And what if that teacher also kind of speaks in a certain way? Now I started with I started with the necessity for the existence of a creator, and more and more and more, I'm having to accept a lot more
But could you look at this and take that interpretation for yourself though, without needing?
I'm not disagreeing with you,
Yeah.
but I'm saying, how do we address these set of questions then? Of, like, it feels in one sense that we end up having to make a whole lot more room for things than we started with. And perhaps that is a necessity, right? That it's not just necessity for profit, but also everything else that comes with it and entails with it. Because yeah, like when we approach Hadith, right, we might have to be able to have a specific eye or trained eye to be able to extract a universal principle there, or the understanding, as you were saying, trying to understand how is the sort of Quranic meaning being expressed or lived here. But like, it just seems like that would be the sort of opposition that arises. Like, is maybe I was ready to accept the prophet, but now I'm having to be ready to accept a lot more authority figures than I signed up for.
Well, I know you want to say something, but I would say one thing is that, it's going back to what you said, like, what is my expectation of the prophet to begin with? Because am I just stepping back and just projecting something onto him, saying that I guess what I'm trying to say is am I trying to conform him to what my expectations are, or am I simply saying, I need somebody to help explain to me what the world means? And then if he speaks in metaphor, just like the fact that if I'm to know him, I can only know him through narrations. If he's to explain to me what the world means, can he really use anything but analogy or metaphor, really? I mean, is there any other way to do so? Or symbolically
He
speaking?
used a lot of.
Yeah, exactly. Because when we talk about abstract ideas or theoretical ideas, is there any other way? Just like I don't question when somebody says I need to put a red light up here and say that means stop, because that's how I perceive things that are abstract.
Yeah. I guess another point would be, so we can, yes, approach it from the angle you mentioned, by the way, we don't have much time, I guess. That, we need interpretation for Quran, we need interpretation for Hadith, we need interpretation for that interpretation, and so on and so forth. Or, which would give us an endless chains of interpretations. In one sense, sorry? Or commitments, yes. In one sense, yes, actually it is true. Like, there is no escape from interpretation in our life. As you said, everything is symbolic.
Right now we're interpreting each other.
Exactly. So the interpretation is not, bad in itself. Well, another way to approach it, maybe the only thing that needs to be changed is you. Not that Quran is closed, or not that the Hadith is closed, but you, as a person of Birkan, as a person, is close to all of them. Hands need to be opened. And then the Quran will become clear, the Hadith will become clear, and so on. That's another way to look at it. I guess in all of these, and how we become open to them, the question, I guess, is again about our expectations and about how we define them. Like, when we read a Hadith, we are reading it from prophet, not from a politician, not from a military guy, not from a state person, not from the scientist or whatever. We think, as Muslims, we love to glorify our prophet, saying that he was a great thinker, he was a great military expert, and so on. We are insulting him without knowing. He was a prophet, he was not anyway. Hence, we shouldn't forget that one thing. He is a prophet, meaning whatever he says is trying to teach us, as you said, something about our Creator. It's not about the sun, it's about our Creator. He is talking, he's looking at the hereafter, not to this world, but what is beyond this here, like this world. Whatever we read, we should read from this perspective. And also, at the same time, he was human, living with human society, within a human society. So whatever he said was using human tools, or you said another word for it.
Metaphor, analogy.
All these metaphor analogies are tools that we use as humans, right? So he used a lot of metaphors, he used a lot of analogies because he was speaking to a human being like myself. And this is my expectation. I want him to speak to me. And there are all these, the aspects. There are some other aspects as well about the narrations, like they are coming through human beings, so probably they sometimes loaded to things they learned from other sources as well. There are such, the aspects. But to the extent we know what we expect from Quran, and then what we expect from its practical guide, then I guess the closeness or openness or interpretation or not interpreting, or being obscure or not, let's say, because the interpretation always will be there. But being obscure or not, it's more about, I guess, whether we are in line with their reality or not. Like, it is from a prophet. If you read it that way, you will understand it. But if you read it from a scientist, you will not understand it. So maybe it's us that needs to be checked first and foremost. Let's conclude here,
Yes,
but
sir.
I'd like to conclude with a question that we will hopefully address in the next session. That yes, we have these narrations, let's say they are all trustworthy. I don't have any other reason, I don't have any reason to think otherwise, but they are still narrations. Which also related to your question, like this is narration, it needs interpretation. Is this the only thing that I have about the prophet?
Is this the prophet?
Is this the prophet? Exactly. Because if this is the prophet that I'm referring to, the narration, then we are in trouble of these endless interpretations and so on.
It's, again, not human, it's text.
Yes, it's not a human, it's a text. And we start with a human guide when we start with our needs. What am I going to do? Like you said, you will address my human needs, having a human guide, a living prophet, and all you gave me is a narration, a text. What am I going to do with this? I guess we will try to address this question, inshallah, in the next session and conclude there. Jazakallah khairan. That was a lovely discussion. Thank you. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وآخر دعواهم أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. الفاتحة.